The most dangerous thing a broken person can do is find someone who makes them want to be whole. Unknown. Love is not about possession. It is about appreciation. Osho. Prologue. Before the storm. There are people who enter your life quietly. They do not knock. They do not announce themselves. They simply appear, in a corridor, in a courtroom, at the edge of a river at dusk, and by the time you recognize what they are to you, they have already rearranged everything inside you, and there is no going back. Elias Voss did not believe in such things. He was a man who believed in evidence, in arguments, in the cold, clean architecture of logic. He believed in the law the way a priest believes in scripture, not blindly, not without scrutiny, but with a devotion so deep it had become the marrow of him. He had built his career on the firm conviction that justice, when pursued honestly and without compromise, was worth any price. He had paid that price in many currencies. In sleep. In relationships that withered on the vine because he could not water them. Too consumed, always, by the next case, the next injustice, the next wrong that needed righting. He had paid it in the slow erosion of softness, which he did not mourn, because he told himself he did not need it. He was 38 years old when the Dreyer case finally broke open. When the evidence that had eluded him for 4 long years finally aligned itself into something incontestable. When a man who had destroyed the lives of dozens of young women was finally cornered. And in the wreckage of that case, like something fragile and extraordinary that had somehow survived a hurricane, he found her. Her name was Sarah, and she would undo him, slowly and completely, in the way that only the truest things can. Chapter 1. The last day of the Dreyer trial. The morning of the final hearing, Elias Voss stood at his office window on the 14th floor of the Harrington building and watched the city below him wake up. It was 6:42 in the morning. He had been here since 4. Cape Aldenmore spread itself out in gray and amber below, a city that was, on its surface, polished and prosperous. Old money in the northern districts, new money in the glass towers along the waterfront. And in between, in the places that did not photograph well, the places that did not appear in the city's promotional materials, the ordinary machinery of suffering grinding on, as it always had. He knew both worlds. He had been born into one, and had chosen the other. The Voss name meant something in this city. His grandfather had built a shipping empire. His father had turned that into a dynasty of quiet influence, not the showy kind, but the kind that moved in boardrooms and private clubs and made calls that were answered. Elias had grown up in the house on Whitmore Crescent with its high ceilings and its rotating roster of staff and its long, echoing silences, and he had understood from a very young age that wealth and love were not the same thing, and that a house could be beautiful and entirely cold. He had been sent to the best schools. He had been expected to study economics or business or perhaps medicine, something befitting the Voss legacy. Instead, he had enrolled in the law program at Aldenmore University and had graduated at the top of his class with a singular, almost austere purpose. He intended to be useful. Not successful. Not celebrated. Useful. Those around him had predicted he would soften that ambition with time, would be seduced eventually by the comfortable billings of corporate law, by the kind of work that did not bruise you. They had been wrong. 16 years after graduating, Elias ran a small, deliberately lean firm, 2 junior attorneys, a paralegal, and a researcher, that specialized in cases that other firms considered too expensive, too complex, or too thankless to take on. He did not advertise. He did not need to. The work found him. The Dreyer case had found him 4 years ago, in the form of a thin woman named Mrs. Adeola Nkosi, who had sat across from him in his conference room and told him, in a voice stripped of emotion by grief, that her 16-year-old daughter had vanished 18 months earlier, and that the police had told her there was not enough evidence to open a formal investigation. He had taken the case the same day. What followed was 4 years of painstaking, often infuriating work. Victor Dreyer was not a careless man. He was wealthy, not old money wealthy, but the kind of new money that had learned quickly how to insulate itself. He had lawyers. He had connections. He had the practiced, almost charming veneer of a legitimate businessman, a chain of hospitality ventures, a charitable foundation, a carefully maintained public profile. He had, over the course of many years, trafficked dozens of young women across 3 countries. He had done it with the kind of methodical patience that made Elias's chest tight with a particular species of cold fury every time he reviewed the case files. But Dreyer had made mistakes, small ones buried deep. And Elias was the sort of man who had the patience to dig. By the time the trial opened, Elias had assembled a case that was, in his own private assessment, airtight. He had witnesses. He had financial records. He had testimony from 3 women who had survived Dreyer's operation and had agreed, at enormous personal cost, to speak. He needed one more. He had known about her for 6 weeks, a young woman, currently housed in a facility run by a women's refuge organization on the eastern side of the city. Her name, in the case files, was listed only as Subject 7. The social workers who had found her had told Elias that she was young, very young, and that she had been in Dreyer's possession for nearly 3 years, taken at the age of 18 from a bus station in a small town 4 hours north of Cape Aldenmore. They had told him she was not speaking, that she had not spoken voluntarily to anyone in the 6 weeks since she had been found. Elias had driven to the facility on a Tuesday afternoon in November, prepared to be patient. He had not been prepared for her. *****. The room they brought him to was small and clean, with a window that looked out onto a narrow garden that had been planted with lavender and rosemary. She was sitting in a chair near the window when he entered, and she did not turn. He had been told she was 21. She looked younger than that, and older simultaneously, the way that people who have experienced things they should not have experienced often do, as if their youth and its premature ending existed in the same space, unresolved. She was slight. Her hair was dark and fell loose around her face, and she had drawn her knees up to her chest in the chair, her feet bare on the cushion. She was looking at the garden, not at anything in it, specifically, just at it, as though the lavender was something she was still deciding whether to trust. Elias sat down across from her. He did not introduce himself immediately. He set his briefcase beside him and was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden too. The silence stretched. "The rosemary is doing well," he said finally, because it was true. She did not respond, but something in her posture shifted, barely perceptible, a very slight loosening around the shoulders. He gave his name. He explained briefly who he was and what he was doing. He told her that her testimony was not required, that she was not obligated to participate in the case in any way, that he was there only to speak with her if she wished. He told her that whatever she chose, the case would proceed. Then he was quiet again. 3 minutes passed. He had counted silently. "What will happen to him?" she asked. Her voice was low and unused sounding, like a room that had been closed for a long time. "If the evidence holds, and I believe it will," Elias said, "he will be convicted on multiple counts of human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and unlawful imprisonment. He will go to prison for a very long time." "How long?" "Long enough that you will not need to be afraid of him for many years." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Will they ask me what happened to me?" "If you testify, yes. I would prepare you thoroughly. You would know every question in advance. I would be there. You would not face it alone." Another silence. Longer this time. "My name is Sarah," she said. "In case they need it." Elias looked at her. She was still looking at the garden. But she had offered him something, her name, which was small and which was enormous, and he understood it as the first crack of daylight through a very long dark. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, and he meant it with a weight that had nothing to do with the case. Chapter 2. The shape of her silence. In the weeks that followed, Elias visited Sarah 3 more times before the trial's final phase began. He told himself these visits were preparation, that they were professional necessity, that he was simply ensuring she was adequately supported, which was part of his responsibility to any witness under his care. He was not entirely honest with himself. The truth was that she stayed with him between visits in a way that his other cases did not. Not because of what she had survived, though that was a weight he carried, as he did with all of his clients, but because of something harder to name. Something in the quality of her attention, the way she listened with her whole self when he spoke, as if words were rare and precious things not to be wasted. Something in the dry, quiet flicker of which she occasionally revealed, always unexpected, like a window opening briefly in an otherwise shuttered building. He had worked with many women who had survived tremendous things. He admired them all. But with Sarah there was something that unsettled him in a way he chose not to examine closely, which was itself telling, because Elias Voss generally examined everything. During the 3rd visit, she asked him questions about himself. "Why did you become a lawyer?" He had answered this question many times for journalists and colleagues and prospective clients, and he had a smooth, practiced answer for it involving justice and accountability and the proper function of institutions. He began to give that answer to Sarah and stopped partway through, because she was watching him with those dark, too steady eyes, and he had the uncomfortable sense that she would know the difference between the real answer and the rehearsed one. "I grew up watching people use wealth as a shield," he said instead. "People who did things that should have had consequences, and didn't, because they had the money to insulate themselves. I wanted to learn the language that could cut through that insulation." She nodded slowly. "Did it work?" "Sometimes. Not always." "Not always," he admitted. "The law is a tool. It can be used well or badly. It's still operated by human beings, which means it inherits all the same flaws." She was quiet for a moment. "But you keep doing it?" "Yes. Even when it doesn't work?" "Especially then." She seemed to turn this over, examining it. "Then, I think that might be the bravest thing I've heard." He did not know what to do with that. He was not accustomed to being called brave. He was accustomed to being called formidable, relentless, occasionally ruthless. Brave was different. Brave implied vulnerability, and he had always believed himself immune to that charge. He did not say this to her. He changed the subject, but he thought about it on the drive home. The city slipped past him in the dark, and he thought about bravery and what it actually looked like, stripped of its more heroic connotations. He thought about a young woman sitting in a room with a stranger who was asking her to relive the worst years of her life in front of a courtroom, and saying yes, giving her name, because she believed it might make a difference. He thought that was considerably braver than anything he had ever done. Sarah testified on the third day of the final hearing. She wore a blue dress that the refuge workers had found for her. She sat very straight in the witness stand, her hands folded in her lap, and she spoke in that low, careful voice of hers, measured, exact, without the theatrical trembling that lesser lawyers sometimes tried to coax from witnesses, because Elias had told her simply to tell the truth, as plainly as she could, and trust that the truth was sufficient. It was more than sufficient. He watched the jury as she spoke. He had been watching juries for 16 years. He knew what it looked like when testimony landed, when it moved past the courtroom's procedural surface and struck something real in the human beings sitting in those chairs. He watched their faces change as Sarah described, in plain language, what had happened to her. How she had been recruited. How she had been transported. What the years inside Dreyer's operation had looked like from the inside. She did not cry. She did not ask for sympathy. She simply spoke. Dreyer's defense attorney attempted a cross-examination that was thorough and occasionally cruel, and Sarah answered every question with the same quiet composure, and Elias watched the attorney realize, gradually and visibly, that he was not going to shake her, and adjust his approach accordingly. When it was over, when Sarah stepped down from the stand and walked back through the courtroom, she passed the table where Elias sat, and their eyes met briefly. He gave her a small nod. She returned it. 2 days later, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Victor Dreyer was sentenced to 22 years without the possibility of parole. Elias was in the courthouse corridor, speaking with his junior attorney, a young man named Daniel Park, who had been with the firm for 3 years and was still young enough to feel genuine joy at a verdict, when one of the refuge workers, a woman named Bongi, approached him and asked if she could have a word privately. He followed her to a bench near the tall windows at the end of the hall, where the November light came in pale and thin. "She's asked us not to tell you this," Bongi began, and Elias felt the specific quality of stillness that preceded bad news. "But I can in good conscience keep it from you, given everything. She trusts you, which means I do too. Tell me." "Sarah is pregnant. She was 4 months along when we found her. She's now just past 6 months. Bongi paused. "She's been making inquiries. She's trying to find a way to end the pregnancy, even at this stage. Given the circumstances, there may be medical grounds, but the process is complex and she's..." Another pause. "She's also spoken to one of our counselors about not wanting to continue herself. About feeling as though she doesn't see a way forward." The words landed in Elias's chest with a weight that was almost physical. "Where is she now?" he asked. "In the gardens behind the building. She wanted some air after the verdict." He stood. "Sarah is pregnant. She was 4 months along when we found her. She's now just past 6 months. Bongi paused. "She's been making inquiries. She's trying to find a way to end the pregnancy, even at this stage. Given the circumstances, there may be medical grounds, but the process is complex and she's..." Another pause. "She's also spoken to one of our counselors about not wanting to continue herself. About feeling as though she doesn't see a way forward." The words landed in Elias's chest with a weight that was almost physical. "Where is she now?" he asked. "In the gardens behind the building. She wanted some air after the verdict." He stood. That's all I'm asking. She turned back to the ginkgo tree. Your car is the black one. In the second row of the car park. He blinked. Yes. A very serious car for a very serious man, she said, and the faintest ghost of something that was almost a smile moved across her face. He stood to leave. Then, I'll be outside the refuge at 9 tomorrow morning. In case you want to come and see the house. There's no pressure either way. He was back at his car before he let himself notice that his hands were not entirely steady. Chapter 4. The House on Carver Lane. She came. At 9:14, not 9, which he suspected was deliberate. The small autonomy of someone who had been told when to appear and when to disappear for too many years. She came through the front door of the refuge with a single bag and the look of someone walking towards something they haven't entirely decided about yet, and she got into the passenger seat of his serious black car without a word. He drove. The house was in a part of Cape Aldenmore that had the quiet dignity of old residential streets, wide pavements, plain trees that had been there for decades, houses that had been built to last. It was not the grandest house on the street, though it was substantial. He had bought it 7 years ago, mostly for the library and the garden, and it had taken him 2 years to remember to furnish the rest of it properly. He unlocked the front door and stood aside for her to enter. She stepped into the front hall and stopped. He watched her look at it, the wide hall with its wooden floors and the painting on the north wall, a landscape by a local artist he had bought years ago, all moorland and low cloud. The bookshelves visible through the open door to the study. The staircase with its worn runner in navy and green. The kitchen at the end of the hall, where the morning light came in through the south-facing window and made everything golden. She stood for a long time. This is a home, she said quietly, almost to herself. I'm told it is, he said. I'm sometimes not the best judge. I work too much. She turned and looked at him with that considering look. You live alone? My housekeeper comes Tuesdays and Fridays. Otherwise, yes. And you want to put a baby in this house. And a person, yes. She almost smiled again. It was like watching a very cautious animal decide, incrementally, that it was safe. He showed her the room he had prepared, a large room on the first floor, away from the street, with a private bathroom and a door to the garden. He had put fresh flowers on the windowsill. He was not entirely sure why. It had seemed right. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. You put flowers, she said. The garden had too many. It seemed a waste. A long pause. Then she walked into the room, set her bag on the bed, and sat down beside it. She looked at her hands. I've never had a room, she said. Not one that was mine. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He stood in the doorway and let the statement exist. After a moment she looked up. Okay, she said. Okay, let's do the contract. And then okay. I'll stay. He nodded. He was very careful not to let his expression do anything unusual. I'll have Daniel draw it up today. We can review it tomorrow. I want to read every word myself. I would expect nothing less. She looked at him for a moment, and this time the ghost of a smile stayed a little longer. You're a very strange man, Elias Voss. So I've been told. I mean it as a compliment. He left her to settle in. He walked back down the hall to his study and sat at his desk and stared at the wall for a considerably longer time than was entirely professional, before pulling up his email and writing to Daniel about the contract. Chapter 5. The Education of Ordinary Things. She learned the house by increments. This was how she had always learned things, carefully, methodically, testing each new territory before committing her weight to it. It was a survival instinct, he understood, encoded into her by years of needing to read rooms and read people quickly, to know where the exits were, to never be surprised. He tried to be predictable around her. He arrived when he said he would arrive. He left when he said he would leave. He told her what his schedule looked like in broad terms, so that the house had the rhythm of a known quantity. She noticed everything. He noticed that she noticed. In the mornings he was always up before her, a habit so old it had become physiological. He simply could not sleep past 5:30. He made coffee and sat in the kitchen with case files or the morning paper, and she would appear sometime between 7 and 8, wearing whatever she had assembled from the small amount of clothing she had arrived with, and she would stand in the kitchen doorway for a moment, long enough to register that the room was safe, that he was in his usual place, doing his usual thing, and then she would come in and make herself tea. They did not always talk in the mornings. He understood that she did not want to. Silence, for her, was not absence but presence. She was in the silence, fully there, simply not talking, and he found after a few days that he did not mind it. He was a man who had always been comfortable with quiet. On the fourth day, she stood at the kitchen window for a long time after making her tea. The garden was visible from there, his garden, which was large and somewhat overgrown, full of old rose bushes and a fig tree and a vegetable patch that he tended with more optimism than skill. "Can I go in the garden?" she asked. He looked up from his files. "Of course. It's your garden too, while you're here." She looked at him for a moment, as if checking whether he meant it. Then she opened the back door and went outside. He watched through the window, not intrusively, just for a moment, as she walked the perimeter of the garden slowly, trailing her fingers along the rose bushes, bending to examine something near the base of the fig tree. She stood for a long time in the center of the garden, her face turned up slightly, her eyes closed. The November sun was thin but present, and it caught her hair and made it warm. He looked back at his files. She was reading everything she could find. He discovered this on the sixth day, when he came home from the office to find her in the library, a room she had been tentative about entering until that point, as if it required permission of a different kind than the garden. Sitting cross-legged in the window seat with a novel open on her lap and 3 other books stacked beside her, spines up to mark her place. She looked up when he came in, a very slight defiance in her expression, preemptive, the look of someone who expected to be told they were taking too much. "The library is for using," he said mildly. The defiance faded. She looked back at the book. He settled at his desk. "Worked for 2 hours." She read. When Miriam, his housekeeper, a forthright woman in her late 50s who had worked for Elias for 6 years and was therefore entirely without ceremony, arrived on Tuesday morning and found a young pregnant woman in the kitchen making scrambled eggs and reading a book about the history of cartography at the same time, she stopped in the doorway and regarded this scene with calm interest. "You must be the young woman the lawyer brought home," she said. Sarah looked up from the eggs. "I'm Sarah. I'm Miriam. I clean the house. That man cannot fold a towel." She put down her bag. "Do you like to cook?" "I'm learning." "Good. Then we'll learn together. Those eggs need more butter." From that day forward, Tuesday mornings belonged to Miriam and Sarah and Elias, who had always been careful not to take up too much space in his own kitchen on the days Miriam came, found himself loitering in the hall on those mornings, listening to the warm, indistinct sounds of 2 women talking and laughing about things he couldn't quite hear, and experiencing an unfamiliar, pleasant quality of ache that he couldn't precisely name. She was reading everything she could find. He discovered this on the 6th day, when he came home from the office to find her in the library, a room she had been tentative about entering until that point, as if it required permission of a different kind than the garden. Sitting cross-legged in the window seat with a novel open on her lap and 3 other books stacked beside her, spines up to mark her place. She looked up when he came in, a very slight defiance in her expression, preemptive, the look of someone who expected to be told they were taking too much. "The library is for using," he said mildly. The defiance faded. She looked back at the book. He settled at his desk. "Worked for 2 hours." She read. When Miriam, his housekeeper, a forthright woman in her late 50s who had worked for Elias for 6 years and was therefore entirely without ceremony, arrived on Tuesday morning and found a young pregnant woman in the kitchen making scrambled eggs and reading a book about the history of cartography at the same time, she stopped in the doorway and regarded this scene with calm interest. "You must be the young woman the lawyer brought home," she said. Sarah looked up from the eggs. "I'm Sarah. I'm Miriam. I clean the house. That man cannot fold a towel." She put down her bag. "Do you like to cook?" "I'm learning." "Good. Then we'll learn together. Those eggs need more butter." From that day forward, Tuesday mornings belonged to Miriam and Sarah and Elias, who had always been careful not to take up too much space in his own kitchen on the days Miriam came, found himself loitering in the hall on those mornings, listening to the warm, indistinct sounds of 2 women talking and laughing about things he couldn't quite hear, and experiencing an unfamiliar, pleasant quality of ache that he couldn't precisely name. Chapter 7. The Night of the Storm. The baby came on a night in February when a thunderstorm was moving in from the coast, filling the house with that particular electric closeness that arrives before rain, the world holding its breath. Elias had been awake. He was often awake late. It was his best thinking time, the hours between 10 and midnight when the day's administrative noise had subsided and he could work without interruption. He was in his study when he heard the sound from upstairs. Not a cry exactly. More a sharp intake of breath, and then a controlled silence that was somehow louder than any noise. He was up and at her door in under a minute. "Sarah, it's starting." Her voice was completely calm. It was the calmness of someone who has decided the one useful thing they can do is not panic, and has committed to it utterly. He called Dr. Sarpong. He brought Sarah's bag to the door. He drove through the beginning of the storm, the rain starting just as they reached the hospital, and he sat in the corridor outside the delivery suite and answered emails he couldn't focus on for 4 hours while the storm built and broke and settled, and the world outside went from night to a pale, washed dawn. Dr. Sarpong found him in the corridor at 6:17 in the morning. "She did beautifully," she said. "Both are well. A girl." Elias put down his phone. "Can I? She's asking for you." He went in. Sarah was sitting up in the bed, and she looked like someone who had done something extraordinary and knew it, stripped down to something essential and clear. She was holding the baby, who was wrapped in white and was very small, and was looking at the world with the unfocused, ancient intensity of the newly born. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at them both. "Hello," he said, because it was the only thing there was. "Hello," she said back. She looked down at the baby, then up at him. Her eyes were very bright. "She's perfect." "Yes. Do you want to hold her?" He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the bed, and she transferred the baby into his arms with the practiced care of someone who has just learned to do something and is doing it very seriously. The baby was impossibly light. She blinked up at him. "I was thinking," Sarah said, watching him, "about the contract. We don't have to think about that now. I want to." A pause. "I want to be in her life. I don't know how yet. I don't know what that looks like. But I can't." "Sarah." She stopped. "You don't have to decide everything at once," he said. The contract was a legal framework, not a wall. Whatever is best for her, and for you, we can figure out together. There's time. She was quiet, looking at the baby in his arms. "I want to call her Lena," she said. "If you agree." He looked down at the baby. She was looking at him with her ancient, blinking seriousness. "Lena," he said. "That's a good name." Outside the hospital window, the morning after the storm was breaking clear and very bright. Chapter 8. The things she felt. She had not been told, when she was very young, what love was supposed to feel like. The women around her in her earliest years, her mother, her mother's friends, the rotating cast of women who moved through the cramped apartment above the convenience store where she had grown up, had spoken about love mostly as something that wounded you, something that left, something that was never quite enough or always too much. She had not had a model of love that was steady and present and kind without motive. So when she felt it taking shape inside her, she did not immediately know what it was. She knew it first as a heightened awareness. She had always been perceptive, survival had required it, but this was different. She knew where he was in the house by the particular sounds, the specific creak of his study chair when he leaned back to think, the way his footsteps changed in register when he was tired versus when he was energized by a problem, the sound of him making coffee at 5:30 in the morning which had, over weeks and months, become the sound of safety. She knew it as attention. She listened to him. She absorbed the things he said and the things he didn't say. She noticed when a case was weighing on him and when it was going well. She noticed the small signs of pleasure, a particular quality of focus that came over him when he was reading something interesting, the way his expression shifted when Lena did something new. She knew it as longing, not yet physical, though she was aware of him in that way too, with the complicated mixture of fear and fascination that she was still learning to disentangle from her history, but a longing to be in the same room as him, to hear him speak, to be the recipient of the small, contained smile he sometimes directed at her when she said something he found unexpectedly sharp. She had lived in his house for 8 months when she understood what it was. She was in the library, reading, which was her favorite occupation, the one thing she had found in this new life that felt entirely and uncomplicated hers. He had come in to get a book from the upper shelves, something she could not reach yet, not that he would have noticed this, and she had watched him move through the room with the particular unself-conscious ease he had in his own spaces, and something had come loose in her chest, a warm and frightening thing, and she had put her book down and looked at her hands and thought, oh, she was in love with him. She sat with this for a very long time. She turned it over. She examined it from all sides, the way she had learned to examine all things, with care and without sentiment. She listed the reasons it was impossible. He was 17 years older. He was her benefactor. He was the man who had helped rescue her from the worst period of her life, which meant the dynamic between them was permanently tilted. He was a man who kept the most important parts of himself behind glass, who had told her himself that his record with closeness was poor. And then she listed the other things, the ones she could not dismiss, the pencils on the library table, the doctor who came to the house, the way he had held Lena in the delivery room and looked at her with an expression of uncomplicated wonder that was the most open she had ever seen him, the countless mornings of parallel quiet, the evenings of unhurried conversation, the sense, which she had never had in her life before and which she did not know how to be without, of being safe. She decided not to say anything. She was 21 years old, and she had no experience with love, and she was fairly certain that declaring yourself to the man who had taken your baby and given you a room in his house was the least straightforward situation she could possibly be in. She decided to simply exist in it and see what happened. Chapter 9. Isla. She appeared in September. He mentioned her first, carefully, which was how Elias handled things he thought might require careful handling. He mentioned that he had met someone, a colleague, tangentially, someone he had encountered through a professional acquaintance. He mentioned it over dinner, looking at his plate for longer than was usual for him. Sarah said, "Oh." She made her voice very light. "Her name is Isla. She works in corporate litigation. She is very capable." Very capable. Sarah had spent enough time around Elias to understand this as high praise. She said, "That sounds good," because it was the right thing to say, and it was not entirely a lie, because some part of her did want him to be happy, in the distant, theoretical way that you can want good things for someone while simultaneously hoping they come from you. He looked up from his plate. He studied her face, briefly. He had a disconcerting habit of looking for things in her expressions. "Are you all right?" "Of course." A pause. "I don't want it to change anything. About the arrangement. It won't change anything. Lena is here. I'm here. That doesn't change." She smiled at him. She had become, over the months, much better at smiling in ways that did not quite reach the interior. He accepted this. He went back to his food. Under the table, she pressed her foot hard against the leg of her chair and breathed. Isla Vance was objectively beautiful. Sarah saw her for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in October, when Elias brought her to the house. He had told Sarah in advance, naturally, predictably, because he was Elias and he arranged things. And Sarah had arranged herself. Also, she had made sure she was in the garden when they arrived, where she could be briefly introduced and then reasonably absent. Isla was tall, with the kind of dark, arranged beauty that came with good bone structure and the knowledge of how to dress it. She was poised and pleasant, and she shook Sarah's hand and asked about Lena with what seemed like genuine interest, and she was everything, in other words, that was reasonable to hope for in a person. Sarah liked her. This made everything considerably worse. She retreated to the garden and spent an hour pulling up weeds that didn't need pulling, because it was the only thing she could think of to do that involved directing her energy somewhere useful. Miriam appeared in the doorway. "She seems decent," Miriam said, because Miriam had no patience for circumlocution. "Yes," Sarah agreed. "He looks nervous." "He doesn't usually look nervous." "That's good, isn't it? People should be a little nervous about the things they care about." Miriam looked at her for a long moment with the particular quality of attention she sometimes deployed, not unkind, simply direct, like a spotlight. "You're a very reasonable young woman," Miriam said finally. "I sometimes think you're too reasonable for your own good." She went back inside. Sarah sat in the garden and breathed and looked at the fig tree and did the mathematics of an impossible situation and got the same answer she always got and went back to pulling weeds. Chapter 10. What stays and what goes. She had stayed longer than the arrangement had specified. The original agreement, which she had read every word of as promised, had outlined housing and support through the pregnancy and for 6 months following the birth. It was now 14 months after Lena's birth, and she was still here. This had happened gradually, by mutual and mostly unspoken consent. The first extension had come when Dr. Sarpong had recommended a period of additional psychological support, and Elias had arranged a therapist without question. The second extension had come when Lena, at 3 months old, had developed a preference for falling asleep to the sound of Sarah reading aloud that was so strong and so sweetly specific that it became entirely impractical to separate them. The third extension had come when Sarah had enrolled in an online program in literature and art history and needed, she told herself, the stability of a fixed address. She was building a life, incrementally, in the structure he had provided. She knew this. She also knew that at some point the structure would need to be her own. She had begun quietly to make plans. She spoke to her therapist about what it might look like to find her own place. She researched neighborhoods. She did her coursework with a diligence that pleasantly surprised her academic supervisors. She had discovered, genuinely good at learning, had always been, she thought, only there had never been the conditions for it before. She was making a life for herself. She was proud of this, in the way that you are proud of things that cost you something. She was also, in the privacy of her own chest, in love with the man who had given her the conditions to do it, and this was the one thing she could not plan around. And he was falling, with deliberate and careful steps, for Isla Vance, who had every reasonable claim to the space that Sarah could only stand at the edge of. She told her therapist about the love. Not all of it, but enough. What do you think you need to do with it? The therapist asked. Sarah thought about this. Learn to let it be something I carry, rather than something I act on. That's one option. What's the other option? The therapist was quiet for a moment. The other option is to let him know, and accept whatever comes from that. Sarah thought about the look on his face when Isla was in the house. The careful, slightly softened set of him. The nervous quality that Miriam had noticed. Not yet, she said. She did not say, not ever. She was young and she was practical, and she knew that the honest answer to not yet was almost always dependent on things you couldn't see from where you were standing. But, not yet. Chapter 11. The engagement. The engagement was announced in April, 14 months after Elias had met Isla Vance. He told Sarah on a Tuesday evening after dinner, sitting at the kitchen table, where they had had many of their most honest conversations. Lena was asleep upstairs. The house was quiet in its usual way. He had the look of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say, and was now discovering the rehearsal was insufficient. I've asked Isla to marry me, he said. She said yes. Sarah looked at him. She had been expecting this. She had known, in the way she knew things that she did not want to know, that this was the direction things were heading. She had been quietly preparing herself for it, the way you prepare yourself for a winter you know is coming. She did not expect it to land as hard as it did. Congratulations, she said. Her voice was level. She had become very good at level. That's good news. He was looking at her carefully, reading her face. Sarah, it is good news. I mean it. She looked at her hands on the table, looked at the grain of the wood. Are you happy? A pause. I think so. Yes. Then I'm glad. She looked up and gave him the smile she had gotten very good at. The one that was true where it needed to be true, and that closed the door where the door needed to be closed. He accepted it. He was, for all his perceptiveness, a man who was still learning to trust the evidence of his own emotions, and who did not yet know what he was feeling clearly enough to project it onto someone else. After he went to his study, she went upstairs and sat in the chair beside Lena's cot, in the quiet dark, and listened to the baby breathe. Lena slept with her fists curled near her face, the way she always did, and her cheeks were round and warm, and she was entirely oblivious to the enormity of things. Sarah sat there for a long time. And then she did something she had not done in a very long time, something she had told her therapist she was trying not to do. She let herself feel the full weight of it. All of it, without managing it, without the reasonable distance she had maintained. She sat in the dark beside her sleeping daughter, and she loved an impossible man, and she let it hurt the way it hurt. And then, in the morning, she got up. Chapter 12. The slow unraveling. She had not intended to do what she did next. She had intended, in fact, to do the opposite, to begin her careful extraction from the situation, to find her own apartment, to build the life she had been building in a location that did not require her to navigate the presence of his happiness every day. But things have a way, in the human heart, of not proceeding according to plan. The first thing she did was nothing dramatic. She told herself she was staying because of Lena, which was partly true. She told herself she was staying because she was in the middle of her coursework, which was also partly true. She told herself these things in the confident voice of someone who has become practiced at internal misdirection, and she was almost convincing. What she actually did was find reasons. She found that the bathroom tap was dripping, and she called a plumber instead of telling Elias, because she wanted him to come home to a solved problem and the small domestic competence it represented. She found that the garden needed more attention than it was getting, and she made it her project, researching spring planting and spending long afternoons in the dirt, which also conveniently kept her present in the house. She found that Lena had developed a very strong preference for being bathed only after 6 in the evening, and since that was when Elias often came home, this meant being in the room when he came in, Lena in the bath, water everywhere, the kitchen full of the warm domestic noise of ordinary life, which she knew he found. She stopped herself. She was sitting in her therapist's office when she stopped herself, mid-sentence, mid-justification, and heard what she was actually saying, and was quiet for a long time. "I've been engineering reasons to stay," she said. "Yes," her therapist said, without judgment, simply naming the thing. "I've been building a little life inside his life instead of my own." "What do you think is driving that?" "I'm afraid," she said. Not of him. Of the after. She looked at her hands. "I know what his house feels like. I know what it feels like to be safe there. I've never felt safe anywhere else. Sarah, what you've built is real. The safety is real. But you know, don't you, that it can't be contingent on remaining in his house?" "I know. You've been building yourself for 1.5 years. You read. You study. You parent. You cook, I'm told quite impressively." She almost smiled. "The self that feels safe is yours now. Not the house's. Not his. You carry it." She sat with that. It was something she wanted to believe more than she currently did. But she could see dimly where it might be true. She made an appointment the following week to look at an apartment. She did not go to the appointment, because the day before the appointment, she overheard Elias on the phone with Isla, and heard him say, in a voice she recognized as the private, lower register he used in moments of real sincerity, that the wedding date was set for the 3rd of November. And something in her that had been managing itself carefully for a very long time stopped managing. Chapter 13. The things she should not have done. She began, in the weeks that followed, to do things she knew were wrong. Not large things. Not immediately. Small things that each, individually, were defensible. She was lonely, she was afraid. She cared about Lena, she had legitimate concerns. But small wrong things are still wrong things, and they have a way of building on themselves, each one making the next one slightly more available. She called Elias's office on a day she knew he was in meetings, ostensibly about a financial matter she needed guidance on, which was real enough in its fundamentals but not actually urgent. She found herself at a cafe near his office, having mentioned the errand at a time she knew would make the chance of running into him high. She told him, with just enough truth in it to be almost honest, that she had been having anxiety about her living situation, which prompted him to reassure her, to make arrangements, to redirect his attention toward her. She hated herself for each of these things. She did them anyway. It was her therapist who named what she was doing, in the calm, non-judgmental way she had. "You're testing," she said. "You want to know how important you are to him. Whether he would choose you." "I know he wouldn't." "Then why are you testing?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Because I can't stop," she said, and the honesty of it was harder than she expected. "Sarah, you're a young woman who survived something most people can't imagine, and you found the first person in your life who ever treated you with consistent, reliable care, and you fell in love with him. This makes complete sense. And it is also causing you to act in ways that aren't aligned with who you actually are." "I know. The question is, what would it take for you to stop?" She thought about this. "I think I need it to be over," she said finally. "Really over. Not the slow closing that's been happening. Something definitive." What would definitive look like? She couldn't answer that. She left the appointment and drove home in silence. And what she was thinking about, though she would not have admitted this then, was the sheer impossibility of being this close to something she wanted this much and simply, cleanly, letting it go. She thought about it for 3 weeks. And on the afternoon of October 19th, 2 weeks before the wedding date, she made a decision that was the worst one she had ever made, and which was, in the strange and terrible logic of her heart, the only one that felt like truth. Chapter 14. What she did. The plan was not elaborate. Elaborate was for people who had time. She acted on instinct and feeling, which was exactly the opposite of how she had been learning to operate, and she understood this even as she was doing it, the way you can understand that you are making a mistake even as your hands refuse to stop. Isla was alone in the Vance family estate for the afternoon, a fact Sarah knew because she had listened, and she had remembered everything she heard, always, because remembering had once been a matter of survival, and the habit had not left her. She drove there. The house was in the northern district, old money and plane trees, the kind of street she had seen from the outside only. She parked. She walked to the gate with the gun in her jacket pocket, the gun she had kept, one concession to the old life she had told herself was practical, which was a lie she had maintained because she had needed to feel like she had an exit in the event the world proved once again to be unlivable. And she rang the bell. She had intended only to talk. She had intended to ask Isla to release him. She understood that this was not a rational request. She understood that it was the request of someone whose love had crossed from devotion into something that deserved a harder name. She understood all of this, and she rang the bell anyway. What happened after that moved very quickly, and she would not remember all of it clearly for some time. She had the gun. She did not intend to use it. But it was there, and it changed the room, as guns always do. Isla did not scream. She was, as Elias had said, capable. The drive out of the city was long. They went north and then east, into the dry coastal basin that ran along the edge of the escarpment, where there were summer houses made of timber and Rondevelle stone that were empty in the off-season. Sarah knew of one. She had seen it years before, in a life she did not want to remember, and she had never forgotten the key that hung inside the gate post. It was empty. They went inside. They sat across from each other, and Isla looked at her with an expression Sarah could not read, and Sarah held the gun in her lap and did not point it at anything and felt the full, terrible enormity of what she had done settle onto her. An hour passed. Isla's phone had been left in the car. Sarah's phone rang. She looked at the screen. Elias. She stared at his name for a long time. She answered. Chapter 15. The Trade. Tell me where you are. His voice was unlike anything she had heard from him before. Not cold. Not the professional composure she knew so well. There was something in it that was stripped and raw, and it was this, the rawness of it, the evidence that he was not composed, that she had fractured something in him, that sent the first true wave of shame through her. Sarah, please. I know what I've done, she said. I know. Then tell me where you are so I can come to you. She's safe. She hasn't been hurt. I need you to know that. I know that. I know you. Tell me where you are. She closed her eyes. She gave him the address. He arrived in 4 hours. 4 hours that she spent sitting in the same chair, the gun in her lap, and Isla on the other side of the room, and the two women not speaking much, except once, when Isla said quietly, How long have you been in love with him? Sarah did not answer. Isla said, I know you have. I think I've known for a while. Then why? Because he didn't know. A pause. And because a man who doesn't notice that the woman in his house is in love with him either isn't paying attention, which is not true of Elias, or is choosing not to see it. And I thought, she stopped. You thought what? Isla looked at her directly. I thought I could live with that. I'm no longer certain I was right. The silence after that was different. Softer, somehow, and more terrible. When Elias arrived, it was dark. He came to the door and knocked because he would not force it, and Sarah opened it. He looked at her first. Before anything else, before he had even seen inside the room, he looked at her face, and she could not interpret what his expression held. Let her go, she said. I'll stay. That's the trade. There is no trade, he said. His voice was very quiet. Isla, there's a car outside. Daniel is there. He'll take you wherever you need to go. Isla stood. She looked at Elias for a long moment. He looked at her. Something passed between them that Sarah could not read. I'm sorry, Sarah said. She said it to Isla. She meant it. Isla looked at her for a moment. I know, she said. And then she was gone. The door closed. They were alone. Sarah was still holding the gun. She became aware of this suddenly, as if she had forgotten. She put it on the table. Elias looked at the gun. She watched the slight contraction of him. She had known about his phobia, she had known, and she had brought the gun anyway, which was the thing about this night that she thought she would find it hardest to forgive in herself. I'm sorry, she said again. To him, this time. He looked at her for a long time. Then he sat down on the floor, his back against the wall, and he put his head in his hands, and he was very quiet. She sat down on the floor too. Across the room. She pulled her knees to her chest. Outside the wind moved through the dry grass, and the October night made its sounds. Chapter 16. The House of Straw. They did not leave that night. He did not explain this decision, and she did not ask. The night was too late for driving and perhaps also for explanations, and the small house held them in a way that felt, illogically, like something they both needed, the way a fever dreams of a single contained space, and you do not question it. He found blankets. There was wood for the fireplace. He made a fire with the methodical attention he brought to practical tasks, and they sat on either side of it, and outside the wind moved through the grass, and the night was very clear and very still. She waited for him to be angry. She deserved his anger. She understood this entirely. She had kidnapped his fiancée. She had produced a weapon in a space where a weapon should not be. She had committed multiple serious offenses in a single afternoon, and she deserved anger and consequences and every reasonable form of accountability. He was not angry. Or rather, the anger was there, she could feel it in the quality of his silence, but it was not the only thing there, and it was not the loudest thing. He said eventually, "Tell me. Everything. The real thing, not the managed version." She looked at the fire. "I'm in love with you," she said. She had never said it aloud to anyone before. The fact of saying it, plainly, directly, without the soft packaging she had always given it inside herself, was enormous. "I have been for a very long time. I know what it is. I know it's not simple, what's between us. I know you didn't plan for it. I know the power was never equal. I know all of that." She paused. "But it is what it is. And I didn't know how to be in the same house as your wedding date, and..." She stopped. And I went somewhere I should not have gone. I did something I should not have done." She looked at him across the fire. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight. I'm not asking you anything. I just want you to know the truth." He was quiet for a very long time. The fire settled, and he did not speak, and she had learned enough about his silences to know that this one was not dismissal. It was thinking. Chapter 17. What he found. He had spent the 4-hour drive into the dry country doing the thing he always did when feeling outran logic. He had tried to categorize it. He was angry. This was true and uncomplicated. He was frightened, not of what Sarah would do, because he knew her, knew the steel grain of her underneath all the learned stillness, and he did not believe she was capable of real harm. What he was frightened of was arriving and finding something irretrievable. Some version of the night that could not be undone. And this was the part he had no category for, no existing file in which to place it. He was pulled toward her in a way that the situation did not fully explain. He had sat with this for the 4-hour drive, and had not resolved it by the time he arrived. And now they were sitting on opposite sides of a fire in a small house in the middle of nowhere, and she had told him she was in love with him, plainly, without performance, and he was sitting with that too, adding it to the pile of things he didn't know what to do with. He thought about the pencils on the library table. His own hands putting them there without giving himself permission to examine why. He thought about the mornings, the quality of the mornings in his house in the past year, the warmth in them, the specific kind of ease he felt in them, and how that ease had not been about the house, had never been about the house. He thought about the way she had said his name the first time, in the garden behind the refuge, testing the sound of it as if it were something she needed to be careful with. He thought about Lena, and about the February morning after the storm, and about what it had felt like to hold a new life in his arms in a room full of daylight, with Sarah looking at him from the bed. He thought about what Isla had said to him on the phone before she had gotten in the car with Daniel. "I think I always knew. And I think you probably did too, even if you couldn't let yourself look at it." He sat with all of this for a long time, while the fire burned down and the night outside moved through its middle hours, and slowly, like something that has been frozen through a long winter, and is now, incrementally, beginning to move, he understood what he felt. He said to the fire and to the room and to the woman across from him, "I am not good at this." She looked at him. "I have never been good at this. I have avoided it, specifically, because I have a very thorough understanding of what I am like when I'm not performing a role I've practiced. What I'm like in the actual interior of a relationship." He paused. "Which is to say, I don't know what I am to you, Sarah, in the way that you're asking. I haven't let myself know." "Why not?" A long pause. "Because knowing something makes it real, and real things can be taken away." She was very still. She understood this. She had spent most of her life building walls that were about exactly this. "What would you need," she said carefully, "to let yourself know?" He looked at her for a long time. "Time," he said. "And for you too, there are things you need to address. What happened today? What led to today?" "I can't." He stopped and started again. "I believe that what you feel is real. I believe that it matters. And I am telling you that there is something in me that has been moving toward you, in the way that I have spent a long time not looking at. But I cannot let it live in the same space as what happened today. You need help. Real help. And if you will commit to getting it, not for me, not to win something, but because you deserve to be well, then I am willing to sit with what I feel and find out what it actually is." The fire had gone to coals. Outside the night was very quiet. That's not a no, she said. It's not a no. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she pulled the blanket around herself and looked at the coals. Okay, she said. Okay. I'll get help. Not for you. Because I want to be someone who deserves good things. She said this quietly, looking at the coals. And I don't quite think I'm that yet. Sarah. His voice was different, lower, the professional register entirely gone. You have been that since the day you sat in a chair in front of a lawyer and gave him your name. She did not respond to this. She simply sat with it, letting it be true if it could be, in the part of her that was still learning to receive things without deflecting them. They sat in the quiet house until the dawn came. Chapter 18. Charges. The police were at the house on Carver Lane at 9 in the morning. Elias had known they would come. He had driven them back in the early dawn, Sarah in the passenger seat, saying nothing, watching the landscape change as the city reappeared, and he had parked and gone inside and called Daniel and told him to prepare, and then he had made coffee and given Sarah a cup and sat at the kitchen table and waited, because there was nothing else to do. The investigating officer was a man named Lieutenant Bongani Radebe, professional, not unkind, who spoke to both of them with the exact courtesy that experienced police officers use when they are dealing with a complicated situation in a large house with a prominent lawyer. Sarah was taken in for questioning. She went without resistance, which was the only thing she had promised Elias before the police arrived, that she would go quietly, that she would not make it harder. The charge, as it crystallized in the following days, was kidnapping, unlawful detention, possession of an unlicensed firearm. 3 serious charges, each with significant consequences. What made it harder was Isla. Isla Vance was the daughter of Chief of Police Franklin Vance, a man of considerable authority, strict principle, and very limited patience for special treatment in either direction. His daughter had been abducted from the family home. He was not inclined toward mercy. Elias hired the best criminal defense attorney he knew, a woman named Adiz Okafor who was thorough and without sentimentality, and who told him plainly, in their first meeting, that the case was difficult but not hopeless, and that much would depend on the complainant's position. Isla's position was, she would not drop the charges. She has every right, Sarah said, when Elias told her this. She was in the temporary accommodation he had arranged for her, not his house, which was no longer appropriate given the situation, but a clean and comfortable apartment nearby. Lena was with her. I'm not asking her to. You need her to. I need to take responsibility for what I did. That's what I need. He looked at her. She was sitting very straight, and she looked like herself, he thought, like the woman who had sat in a witness stand and answered every question without asking for sympathy. Let me talk to her, he said. Elias. Let me try. Chapter 19. The conversation with Isla. He met Isla at a cafe near her office, 3 days after the charges were laid. She was already there when he arrived, sitting with a coffee and a composure that was, he knew, maintained at some cost. She looked at him as he sat down with an expression that was complex, not hostile, not warm. Something in between that had the quality of a question. Thank you for meeting me, he said. Of course. He ordered coffee. He was quiet for a moment. He had not rehearsed this, which was unusual for him. He had found he did not want to rehearse it. He wanted to say the real thing, which meant arriving at it without a script. I want to tell you something, and I want you to know that I am telling you because you deserve the truth, not because I'm asking you for anything. She set her cup down, waited. What I had with you is real. I am not going to diminish it or explain it away. I cared for you. I was, I think, genuinely trying to build something, a life I recognized as reasonable and good, with a person I respected. He paused. What I didn't know until very recently was that I had been, not dishonest exactly, but incomplete with myself. About what was happening in my house. About what Sarah was to me, or had become. I can't tell you precisely when it happened, because I was not allowing myself to look. But it was there. And when it became unavoidable, I understood that what I felt for you, genuine as it was not the same thing. And that continuing to build something with you while this existed would have been the real dishonesty. Isla was very quiet. Then, what is it you feel for her? He thought about the answer. Something I have no practice with. Something that frightens me considerably. Something I would not choose to feel if choosing were on the table. Not because of her, but because I have a very well-developed instinct for keeping safe, and she is decidedly not safe. He paused. And also something I cannot put down, which tells me it is probably the real thing. A long silence. She committed a crime, Isla said finally. A serious one. Yes. And I am not going to tell you that you're wrong to hold her to account for it. I'm not here to ask you to drop the charges. I'm here because I wanted you to understand what happened, from someone who was present in it. And because I think you deserve the truth about what this is or was, and what it wasn't. She looked at him for a long moment. She was in your house for nearly 2 years, Elias. You didn't know. I chose not to look. There's a difference? He was quiet. Not a morally comfortable one, no. She looked at the table. Something in her expression shifted, the maintained composure softening at its edges into something more private. She's getting help, she asked. She has committed to it. A trauma specialist. She has a history that, the psychological underpinning of what she did is complex and real, which does not excuse the action, but it contextualizes it. Another long pause. I need to think, she said. Take all the time you need. He stood. Isla, I am sorry. For the parts that were mine to own. Genuinely. She looked up at him. There was something in her expression that was tired and clear, and he thought, more honest than anything they had managed while they were together. I know, she said. So am I. Chapter 20. The Chief of Police. Franklin Vance received him in his office at the Central Precinct. He was a large man, not tall exactly, but broad-shouldered and gravitationally substantial, with the bearing of someone who has spent decades in a position where people defer to him. He looked at Elias across his desk with the particular look of a father who has decided to remain professional. I know why you're here, he said. I appreciate you seeing me. My daughter asked me to. I want to be clear that her request is the only reason. Understood. Elias laid it out. He was thorough, he was always thorough, and he was honest about the parts of it that did not reflect well on him. The history of the Dreyer case. Sarah's circumstances. The nature of their arrangement and what it had become. He did not minimize the seriousness of what she had done. He gave Franklin Vance the full picture, and he let it rest. The chief was quiet for a long time. My daughter was in that room for 7 hours, he said. Yes. She was not physically harmed. No. Though that is not a complete defense of the situation, and I would not argue otherwise. Another silence. This young woman, the trafficking survivor. Yes. She testified in the Dreyer trial. She did, under circumstances that required considerable courage. Franklin Vance looked at him. I prosecuted Victor Dreyer's father 25 years ago. Different charges, different decade. The family has a history. He was quiet. I am not unsympathetic to what a person goes through inside a system like that. I've seen enough of it. He paused. But the law is the law. I know. I have never argued otherwise. I am asking for proportionality, not exemption. I am asking that the case be considered in its full context, including the significant mitigating circumstances and the genuine commitment she has made to rehabilitation. Franklin Vance studied him for a moment. You love her, he said. It was not a question. Elias did not answer immediately. When he did, yes. And she is, whatever she is committed to addressing the root causes. She has already begun. She is in intensive therapy with a specialist in complex trauma. She has accepted full responsibility without qualification. The chief was quiet for a long time. He looked at something on his desk. Then he looked up. My daughter will make her own decision, he said. I will not influence it. What I can tell you is that I will not oppose it, whatever she decides. He paused. I am going to say something to you that I would prefer to remain in this room. Of course. A person who has spent years in that kind of captivity comes out of it damaged in ways that take a very long time to heal. Things that look like madness from the outside are often the last available form of agency for someone who has had all their agency removed. That is not, I want to be clear, that is not a reason to let people off the hook. But it is a reason to think carefully about what justice actually looks like. He stood, indicating the end of the meeting. Talk to my daughter. Chapter 21. What Isla decided. She called him on a Wednesday. I've made my decision, she said. He was in his office. He was very still. I'm dropping the charges. He let out a breath he had not been aware of holding. I want to be clear about why, she said. It's not because of you. It's not for the relationship or what's left of it. It's because, a pause. I sat in that room with her for 7 hours, Elias. And I could see that she was in pain. Real terrible pain. Not the pain of someone who is malicious. The pain of someone who has been hurt in ways that became bigger than her capacity to manage them. Another pause. I've spoken to my therapist. I've spoken to my father. And I think that, her voice was careful, I think that the thing that happened to her years ago and since already constitutes a profound injustice. And I'm not sure that adding another layer of legal consequence is justice. For anyone. Isla. Don't. Please. I need this to be mine. You're right. I'm sorry. A pause. She's getting real help? Yes. Then that matters more than a sentence. Her voice was controlled, and underneath the control, something that was close to grief. I hope you're both. I hope it works out. I mean that. Not easily, because I'm only human. But I mean it. He said her name again, quietly, with nothing attached to it except the weight of what had been. She said, "Goodbye, Elias." He sat at his desk for a long time after the call, doing nothing, which was not something he was in the habit of. Then he picked up his phone and called Adiz Okafor. Then he picked up his phone again and called Sarah. Chapter 21. What Isla decided. She called him on a Wednesday. "I've made my decision," she said. He was in his office. He was very still. "I'm dropping the charges." He let out a breath he had not been aware of holding. "I want to be clear about why," she said. "It's not because of you. It's not for the relationship or what's left of it. It's because..." A pause. "I sat in that room with her for 7 hours, Elias. And I could see that she was in pain. Real terrible pain. Not the pain of someone who is malicious. The pain of someone who has been hurt in ways that became bigger than her capacity to manage them." Another pause. "I've spoken to my therapist. I've spoken to my father. And I think that," her voice was careful, "I think that the thing that happened to her years ago and since already constitutes a profound injustice. And I'm not sure that adding another layer of legal consequence is justice. For anyone. Isla. Don't. Please. I need this to be mine. You're right. I'm sorry." A pause. "She's getting real help?" "Yes." Then that matters more than a sentence. Her voice was controlled, and underneath the control, something that was close to grief. "I hope you're both. I hope it works out. I mean that. Not easily, because I'm only human. But I mean it." He said her name again, quietly, with nothing attached to it except the weight of what had been. She said, "Goodbye, Elias." He sat at his desk for a long time after the call, doing nothing, which was not something he was in the habit of. Then he picked up his phone and called Adiz Okafor. Then he picked up his phone again and called Sarah. Chapter 22. The long work. The charges were formally dropped in November. Sarah was released without a criminal record. The terms of her release included the continuation of her therapeutic program, which she had already committed to, and a period of supervised community engagement, which she undertook with the focused, methodical attention she brought to all things she decided to take seriously. She did not go back to the house on Carver Lane. This was her decision. She told Elias plainly, in one of the careful phone calls they had during that period, "I need to go back to it differently. I need to arrive as myself, not as someone you rescued. If we do this, if we try, I need to come to it from the same level." She paused. "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," he said. She moved into her own apartment, a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood she had chosen herself, where the morning light came in through east-facing windows, and there was a small balcony where she put a pot of rosemary, because it reminded her of the refuge garden, where a lawyer had sat beside her and talked about things that were real. She enrolled in a full-time degree program. She continued her therapy twice weekly, and then once weekly as the months passed, and she tracked her own progress with the same clear-eyed honesty she had brought to everything. "Here is what I did that was wrong. Here is why. Here is what is different now." Lena came to her every weekday morning and every other weekend, and Elias brought her, and sometimes they had coffee in Sarah's kitchen, which was small and sunny and nothing like his, and sometimes they talked for a long time, and sometimes they were quiet, and in either case it was something she had never been able to build in his house in the same way, because there it had always been his home, and hers only by arrangement. Here it was just hers, and the warmth was different. She was building herself. She knew this. She could feel it happening, the slow accumulation of a self that was authored by her own choices, not constructed around someone else's life. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. It was considerably harder than the courtroom. It was also the first thing she had done that was entirely, unambiguously for herself. Chapter 23. What he learned. He told Daniel, one evening in February, the 2nd February since all of it had happened, that he had been doing something he had never done before, which was sitting with feelings long enough to see what they actually were. Daniel, who was 29 and considerably less self-contained than his employer, looked at him with an expression of fond exasperation. Most people call that being human. I call it an extraordinary inefficiency, Elias said. And I have become convinced over the past several months that it is also entirely necessary. He had, in fact, begun therapy himself, something he had not advertised and which had required him to find a therapist who was both competent and willing to deal with the particular combination of emotional literacy and defensive architecture that he presented. The therapist, a man named Dr. Carabo Dlamini, who was unimpressed by professional credentials and very patient with self-protective people, had told him in their third session that his primary relational pattern was to manage the world so thoroughly that intimacy never became necessary. "And how's that working for you?" Dr. Dlamini had asked. "Not exceptionally well at the moment." "Then let's talk about what it would look like to try something different." What it looked like gradually was this. He told Sarah what he thought, without the practiced editorial that had always stood between his interior and the world. He called when he wanted to call. He did not strategize. He did not manage. He was clumsy at it. He had 16 years of professional precision to unlearn. There were conversations that were harder than they needed to be because he defaulted to his closing argument mode, and she called him on it, directly, without rancor, and they had to start over. They started over many times. He found, unexpectedly, that the starting over was not failure. It was practice. Each repair was its own evidence that they could repair, and evidence had always been the thing he most trusted. Chapter 24. The Garden in Spring. The first time she came back to the house on Carver Lane was in March. She stood at the gate for a moment before coming in, not hesitating exactly, more marking the moment, which was different. Then she opened the gate and walked up the path, and he was at the door before she reached it, because he had been watching from the study window with an uncharacteristic inability to look away. "Hello," he said. "Hello." She looked at the house. The garden beginning its spring business, the rose bushes coming back. The rosemary she had planted 2 years ago, now enormous. "The rosemary did well," he said. She looked at him. The expression that crossed her face was something he had not seen before, or perhaps he had seen it before and had not known how to receive it. Something open and wondering and a little afraid and not hiding any of those things. "You said that to me once before," she said. "About the rosemary. In a different garden. I remember." They looked at each other for a moment. "Lena's inside," he said. "She's been asking about the garden." "Of course she has." She stepped past him into the hall. Stopped. Turned. He was still in the doorway watching her. "Are we going to be very careful and slow about this?" she asked. "Is that what we're doing?" "I think careful and slow is probably advisable, yes." She tilted her head. "For how long?" He thought about this. "As long as it takes to do it right." She looked at him for a moment. "Then, I can work with that." She turned toward the kitchen, toward the sound of Lena, who was presumably dismantling something. Then she stopped again. Without turning, "Elias." "Yes. Thank you. For the pencils. And the doctor. And the room." And she stopped. "For sitting in the garden with me the first time, and saying the right thing." He was quiet for a moment. "You said the right thing too. You gave me your name." A pause. Then she said softly, "I did." And she went in to find their daughter. He closed the front door and stood in the hall for a moment. Outside, the plane trees were budding. The rosemary was enormous in the spring light. The house had the sound it got, the particular warm sound, when the people it held were all present. He went into the kitchen. Chapter 25. The Weight of Wildflowers. It was a Wednesday in May when Lena first walked the full length of the garden by herself. She was 14 months old, and she had been walking for 6 weeks, experimentally, and with great enthusiasm and very little stability, and she tended to make each journey a series of successful and unsuccessful negotiations with gravity. She set off from the back step, arms extended for balance, her face set with the particular expression of serious children attempting serious things. Sarah was sitting on the garden bench. Elias was standing near the fig tree, where he had been nominally pruning something and actually watching Lena. Lena walked the length of the garden and arrived at the bench and put her hand on Sarah's knee and looked up at her with an expression of enormous satisfaction. Sarah laughed, a real laugh, unmanaged, the kind that came up before you could do anything about it, and picked her up and held her, and Lena immediately began applying herself to Sarah's hair with both hands. Elias came and sat on the bench beside them. He did not take the space of someone who was visiting. He sat the way he sat in the kitchen, in the specific posture of someone at home in their own life. Lena reached for him, without letting go of Sarah's hair. They sat in the spring garden, the three of them, and the afternoon moved over them in the way that good afternoons do, without hurrying. "She said something this morning," Sarah said. "While you were at the office." She said G.A. G.A. Very clearly. Very emphatically. "A foundational syllable," he said. "The basis for all future argument." Sarah laughed again. He looked at her when she laughed, because he had realized recently that he did this and had stopped stopping himself. She was 23 years old, and she was in her second year of university, and she read 4 books at once and grew things in 2 gardens now, hers and his. And she had been in therapy for 8 months and was becoming, incrementally and visibly, someone who carried herself differently. Not without weight. She would always carry some weight. But the weight was integrated now, part of her rather than something she was managing alone. She looked up and caught him looking at her. She did not look away. "What?" she said. "Nothing. You're doing the thing where you look at me like I'm evidence of something. You are evidence of something." She raised her eyebrows. "Of what?" He was quiet for a moment. "That the world occasionally does the right thing." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were dark and clear and entirely readable to him now, which had taken time and was something he considered, privately, one of the greatest privileges of his life. "Careful," she said. "That's almost poetry. Don't tell anyone. I have a professional reputation." She smiled, the full smile, the real one, the one that still, after all this time and all the earned familiarity, did something to the inside of his chest. Lena said, "Gah. See." Sarah said, "She agrees." He looked at the garden, the rosemary, the fig tree, the rose bushes coming into bud, the afternoon light making everything it touched into something worth having. He thought, this is a life. A real one, irregular and complicated and full of things that had not gone as planned, but real, the way that only things that have been honestly arrived at can be real. He thought, I did not know how to receive this for a long time. I am still learning. He thought, I will keep learning for as long as it takes. Elias. He looked at her. She was watching him with the quiet, clear attention she had, the kind that had seen him from the beginning, through the courtroom composure, through the professional remove, through all the years of practiced self-containment, and found, underneath it all, a man worth looking at. "I'm glad I gave you my name," she said. He reached across and took her hand, which was the simplest thing he had done in a very long time, and which cost him nothing that wasn't worth giving. "So am I," he said. The afternoon stayed. The garden held them. Lena, satisfied with the evidence of her own ambulation, fell asleep between them in the May sun, her small fists uncurling for the first time all day. And the wildflowers Sarah had planted along the fence, because she had read about them and thought they were beautiful, and had simply decided that beautiful things belonged in the world, began finally to open. Epilogue. 3 years later. Sarah Voss, she had taken his name, not because tradition required it, but because she had chosen it, which was the part that mattered, graduated in June. Her degree was in literature and art, which she had selected because these were the things that had saved her, in their way, and she believed that the things that save you are worth understanding formally. Elias came to the graduation ceremony. He sat in the second row with Lena on his lap, who was 3.5 and magnificently opinionated about the color of her shoes. He watched Sarah cross the stage and receive her degree and thought, not for the first time and not for the last. There is a particular kind of love that is built slowly, out of mornings and silence and the honest naming of hard things, and it is different from the love that arrives dramatically and announces itself, and it is, in his experience, considerably more durable. She looked out from the stage as they called her name and found him in the crowd, because she always found him. It was a skill she had developed or perhaps had always had, and she grinned, which was the word for it. Not smiled. Grinned, without management, without reservation, the full unguarded joy of someone who has worked for something and arrived at it. He grinned back, which surprised him. He was getting better at being surprised. Lena said loudly, to no one in particular, "That's Mama." Several people around them turned and smiled. "Yes," Elias agreed. "That's Mama." Afterwards, in the garden of a restaurant they had chosen because Sarah had wanted somewhere with trees, they sat with Miriam and Dr. Sarpong and Daniel, who had brought his new girlfriend, and they ate and talked, and Lena dismantled a bread roll and rebuilt it according to her own architectural principles, and evening came over them in the gradual, golden way of June. At one point Elias looked at Sarah across the table, and she was laughing at something Miriam had said, and the laughter was unguarded, and the evening light was on her hair, and she was entirely, unapologetically present in the moment, the way she had been learning to be, and he thought, I have been good at many things in my life. I have worked very hard at the things I am good at. But the best thing I have ever done was sit down in a garden with a young woman who hadn't spoken in 6 weeks and say, instead of something practiced, something true. He had said, the rosemary is doing well. Small and true. And everything that followed had come from that. She looked over and saw him looking and said, with the private directness she used when she wasn't performing for the table, What? The rosemary, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, and turned back to Miriam. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every meaningful sense, everything. End. Author's note. This novel features themes of human trafficking, captivity, and psychological trauma. The characters' experiences are fictional, but they reflect real patterns of exploitation that affect real people every day. If you or someone you know needs support, please reach out to the appropriate helplines and organizations in your country. You are not alone.